The sun was falling low over the plains, laying golden fingers across the tall grass that rippled like an ocean. The air smelled of dust and horses and faraway rain. The small town of Maple Ridge sat quiet under that dying light, its saloon windows reflecting the sunset in fractured fire. Out there, where the world stretched too wide for loneliness to hide, a cowboy named Luke Rayner rode slow, hat tipped low, the leather reins resting easy in his calloused hand. Luke had ridden through more towns than he cared to count, but none had ever made him stop. He was the kind of man who looked like he carried distance in his bones, broad-shouldered, quiet, with a face the sun had carved into angles. His horse, a gray mare named Dusty, knew his moods better than most people ever had. And when they came down the narrow road into Maple Ridge that evening, it wasn't for whiskey or cards. It was for something he couldn't name. Maybe rest, maybe peace, maybe the soft hum of a woman's voice he hadn't yet heard. The boarding house sat at the edge of town, where the prairie rolled right up to the back fence. A weathered sign hung by one hinge, creaking in the wind. He dismounted, tied up Dusty, and stepped onto the porch. A woman opened the door before he could knock. She was small, the kind of small that looked fragile until you saw her eyes. Her hair was the color of wheat after harvest, and she wore a faded blue dress that had been mended too many times. Her hands twisted in her apron when she looked at him. "Evening, ma'am," Luke said, touching the brim of his hat. "Looking for a bed for a few nights. Heard you might have a room." She nodded. "We've got one. Supper's in the kitchen if you're hungry." Her voice was soft but steady, though she didn't meet his eyes for long. He caught the flicker of uncertainty in her glance, the kind that came from being looked at too many times the wrong way. "Much obliged," he said, stepping inside. The house smelled of bread and soap, of someone trying to keep life neat even when it wouldn't behave. She led him up a narrow staircase to a small room overlooking the prairie. The light through the window touched the dust motes in the air like little ghosts. "I'm Clara," she said, setting a lamp on the table. "Clara Mason. You can settle the bill at the end of your stay." "Luke Rayner," he replied. "Don't plan on causing trouble." Her smile was quick, polite, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "No one ever does, Mr. Rayner. That first night, Luke ate alone in the kitchen after the other boarders had gone. Clara moved quietly around him, washing dishes, the lamplight catching her face in broken pieces. She wasn't what most would call pretty, not in the kind of way that made men stop talking. Her jaw was a bit sharp, her nose small, her skin pale where the sun hadn't touched it. But there was something else, a kind of sadness that made her beautiful in a way she probably didn't see. He found himself watching her hands as they moved through the water. Strong, careful hands. Hands that had worked and lost and still carried on. "Been here long?" he asked finally. "All my life," she said without turning. "My husband built this house. He died 5 years ago." "I'm sorry," Luke said quietly. She shrugged one shoulder. "People die. The world keeps turning." He nodded, because he knew the truth too well. They didn't speak again for a while, but when he left the table, she offered him a small slice of apple pie wrapped in a cloth napkin. "For later," she said, eyes down. "You look like a man who doesn't eat enough." He smiled. "Thank you, ma'am. You're right about that." Days slipped by. Luke helped around the place, fixing a fence, chopping wood, mending the back porch steps. Clara didn't ask, but he did it anyway. Work filled the silence between them, and she stopped flinching when he came near. In the evenings, she'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea while he smoked by the railing. They didn't need many words. One night, a storm rolled across the plains, drumming on the roof and making the windows shiver. The power of it filled the air, and in that charged quiet, Clara spoke. "I used to think storms were God's way of reminding us we're small," she said softly. "But lately I think they're just loud company." Luke chuckled. "You get lonely out here." She looked at the rain. I did, once. But it's different now. Loneliness changes shape after a while. You stop missing people and start missing the parts of yourself you lost with them. He studied her face, the way the candlelight flickered across her cheek. You talk like someone who's done a lot of thinking. Not much else to do, she said, smiling faintly. The next morning, Luke rode out early to bring back supplies for her. When he returned, he found her in the back garden, trying to lift a broken crate of apples. Without a word, he stepped in and took it from her hands. You don't have to do that, she said. I know, he answered, setting it down gently. Doesn't mean I shouldn't. She looked at him then. Really looked, as if seeing him for the first time. Something unspoken passed between them, quiet and uncertain. That night, as they sat together watching the sunset fade into purple, she whispered it, almost too soft for him to hear. I'm not pretty, she said. Luke turned to her, slow and deliberate. That's fine, he said after a moment, voice low. I need honest, not pretty. Pretty fades. Honest stays. She blinked, surprised. You really think that's enough? For me it is, he said. I've seen enough lies dressed up nice. You don't hide what you are. Her eyes glistened in the fading light. And what am I, Mr. Rayner? He smiled slightly. A woman who thinks too little of herself and too much of everyone else. For the first time, she laughed. Not polite, not nervous, but real. It sounded like wind chimes in a forgotten house. Weeks became months. Luke stayed longer than he'd planned. He fixed the roof, repaired the old barn, helped her sell produce at the market. Folks in town started to talk, but neither of them seemed to care. The bond between them grew quietly, like grass after rain, steady, inevitable. Sometimes he told her about the trail, about nights under a sky so wide it made a man feel smaller than dust. She told him about her husband, about how he'd been kind but restless, and how she'd spent years wondering if that was her fault. Luke never judged, just listened. Listening, she realized, was something she hadn't had in a long time. One evening, as summer burned out into fall, Luke came back from town with a small carved box. He handed it to her awkwardly. What's this? She asked. Just something I saw and thought you might like. Inside was a simple hair comb, inlaid with a single blue stone. It wasn't fancy, just thoughtful. She traced the carving with her thumb. It's beautiful. So are you, he said before he could stop himself. Her cheeks flushed. Don't say that. Why not? Because I'll believe you, she whispered. He reached out and brushed his fingers lightly against her cheek. Then do. Winter came early that year. The fields turned white, and the air bit sharp at the lungs. Luke stayed to help her through it, chopping wood and keeping the fire fed. Some nights they talked by the hearth until the embers went cold. Other nights, they just sat in silence, the space between them humming with quiet understanding. Once, he woke to find her asleep in a chair, her head fallen against her shoulder. The light of the fire painted her face in golden shadow. He thought she looked peaceful, like someone who had finally stopped running from ghosts. He covered her with his blanket and went back to bed smiling. By spring, the thaw came, and with it the wildflowers. The prairie turned green again, alive with color and sound. Luke stood on the porch, watching the horizon, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the pull of the road. You thinking about leaving? She asked behind him. He shook his head. Not anymore. She hesitated, then stepped closer. Why not? He turned, looking at her in that soft morning light. Because I finally found something worth staying for. Her breath caught. You don't mean me. He smiled. I mean exactly you. She looked down, the corners of her mouth trembling. I'm not sure I know how to start over. You don't have to, he said. Just keep going. I'll walk beside you. That summer, Luke and Clara worked side by side rebuilding the barn. Dusty grazed nearby while the boards went up, and laughter came easier than it used to. They ate lunch in the shade of the fence, hands rough with work but hearts soft with quiet joy. One afternoon, as they rested, she turned to him. "Do you ever miss the trail?" He thought for a moment. "Sometimes. The sky out there feels bigger. But it's lonely too. Feels like you're chasing something you'll never catch." "And now?" she asked. "Now I think maybe I caught it," he said. She looked at him for a long time, and something in her eyes changed. A calm acceptance, a warmth that had been missing for years. She leaned in and kissed him. Soft, trembling, sure. It wasn't the kind of kiss that starts a fire. It was the kind that ends a storm. Years later, folks in Maple Ridge still talked about Luke Rayner and Clara Mason, the cowboy who stayed and the widow who learned to smile again. They ran the boarding house together, raised horses, and built a life out of the quiet things most people overlook. Sometimes, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of whiskey, she'd lean against him on the porch, her head on his shoulder. "I never thanked you," she'd say. "For what?" "For seeing me." He'd smile and kiss the top of her head. Always did. And when she laughed, it still sounded like wind chimes, the kind that keep playing long after the wind has gone.